Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, August 13th, 2025. And our friend, first time to be our guest on this podcast, Patrick Henningsen, is here. Welcome, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Nima.
Yeah. Just to let us know that Patrick, I'm sure that you know him, and because he's famous in the way that he's talking. He's a journalist and geopolitical analyst and the founder of 21stcenturywire.com. And Patrick, let me start with I want to focus on what's going on in the Middle East, especially between Iran and Israel. But before going there, we know that there would be a meeting between the President of the United States and the Russian president in Alaska. What do you see happening in that meeting? Positive, negative, some somewhere in the middle? How do you find it?
That's a good question. Positive for who, negative for who. There's different answers to each of those depending on which perspective, which party you're referencing there. But let's start with the United States. I don't see there's no deal to be had for Trump. Certainly, Russia is not going to show up in Alaska and agree on anything. There'll be no binding deal there. So it's really kind of a meet and greet, and it's supposedly a prelude to a tripartite meeting between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. But that's again very cloudy and nebulous, and nobody can guarantee that that's actually going to happen immediately, especially with the current president in Kiev, who is in a very unstable political position at the moment. So then that's the question: what is this meeting for? For Donald Trump, it's headlines, and he's in a very, very tight and difficult political position right now in the United States. His MAGA base is fractured because of the Epstein issue, but more than that, the Israel issue is starting to bite him with the MAGA base as well. And he has not got a resolution on all three major flashpoints, which is Ukraine, Gaza, and Iran. And he promised that he was going to, do things that Biden couldn't because Biden was weak, because Biden was incompetent, because Biden this, Biden that, and that he campaigned and got elected on that basis. And he has not been successful on any of these fronts. In fact, a lot of them are disasters. All three of them, I think we can say, are much worse than they were 7 months ago. That's a fair assumption. So what's he going to benefit from meeting with Putin? The only thing I can see from a tactical point of view, I see no strategy, no visible strategy for me. Tactically, I see the United States. Russia's not biting at the heels of America to begging for a ceasefire, right? Russia's not chasing them for a meeting, but Washington wants it. And what Washington wants is to buy time. Washington wants to buy time. And the last time they strung the Iranians along, put a 60-day deadline on, and what happened on the 61st day? A sneak attack against Iran by Israel, followed, but we all know what happened after that. Then Ukraine situation, Istanbul peace talks, a lot of lead up to that. Russia sent a full complementary delegation. So did the Ukrainians sent a delegation. The United States had a delegation. And what happened? A sneak attack, Operation Spider's Web, it was called, and hitting Russia's nuclear deterrent. So Russia cannot be that naive and that stupid to expect there's going to be a different result this time. And so that leads us to the logical conclusion: while it might benefit Trump from a public relations and political point of view and buy time for maybe a sneak attack, maybe who knows what's been planned by the CIA, by the SBU, by NATO intelligence, who knows? Who knows? We'll find out, won't we, on Friday and the weekend. But from the Russian point of view, if we assume they're not going to be played here, this could hugely benefit Russia. And that's the other side of this. And I could tell you why I think that, but I'll just leave there for the moment. If you want to talk about the Russian side, but from the U.S. side, I see nothing. I see no change in the rhetoric. I see no change in the policy. I don't see Steve Witkoff or Donald Trump or anybody saying something that everyone in the world saying, "Wow, they really get it now. They're being honest about the causes of this conflict. They understand how the Minsk Accords broke down. They understand about the people in the Donbass who were under threat. They understand the ethnic Russian and the equal rights and the discrimination issues that were going on under Poroshenko and then later Zelensky. They get this. The United States is ready to negotiate from a platform of reality, because you can't come to the table in a state, international relations, state versus meets state, if you don't have an agreement on the terms of reality. In other words, what are the political realities on both sides? How did we get here? Because you can't chart a path out unless you agree on some basic assumptions. And to date, the United States will not admit not only how they got there, but they won't admit that they're a co-belligerent. And if they're co-belligerent, they're killing Russians, but Russians are not killing Americans. So there's no way that they could really be a partner or any kind of a neutral partner. The United States is pretending to be a referee and to refereeing this fight between Ukraine and Russia. The reality is Russia knows, and a lot of the world knows, the global South knows, certainly, that it's a proxy war. So until they come clean, Russia is just playing the game. I think they're playing the game and doing what they need to do on the ground. But this could backfire badly on Ukraine if they play it wrong. And it could backfire badly on the U.S. and Europe as well.
So on the Russian side, how does Russia benefit from talks, these sort of talks, this sort of stage? In my opinion, nothing deep in that.
Well, if Donald Trump has any deal at all, there's no guarantee that he cannot guarantee that the Ukrainians, Zelensky and the Pravi right, will not sabotage this. And they definitely won't agree to any concessions, not on territory. That it doesn't appear to be the case anyway. They can't guarantee the European Union won't sabotage it, because we know what the European Union wants. They want a long conflict. Defense stocks are going through the roof in Europe. Leonardo, BAE Systems, and the American companies, Lockheed and so forth. The defense military Keynesianism, as it's called in terms of economics, is now in the ascendancy. So you know what their agenda is. The UK, they can't guarantee the UK won't sabotage it. You know, so what can Trump do independently of Ukraine, UK, and Europe? Nothing, not very little, in fact. So there's no guarantee there. But if Trump says publicly that Russia's agreed to terms and that in principle that they're going to accept this, and then I don't believe in this land swap discussion. I don't think there's anything concrete there. I think that might be a miscommunication in terms of the media and what Steve Witkoff and others may have said. But in terms of a deal, if Donald Trump says we've agreed with Putin in Alaska to the framework of a rough deal, obviously needs to be, solidified and get buy-in, and needs to turn into a treaty at some point. But in the interim, if Zelensky rejects that, then you could have political chaos in Ukraine, because already there's a level of discontent in Ukraine that's palpable. And a lot of potential presidential candidates have emerged, and old voices are emerging. So before it was Poroshenko. He was making his sales pitch a few months ago, going out in the Western media. He's clearly auditioning to see if there's any interest for his candidacy. Then you have Zelensky, probably a non-starter. I can't see him running again. If it was, they'd have to fix the election. It would have to be a rigged election. Medvedchuk, probably not, too pro-Russian. Then you have Yulia Tymoshenko has emerged, and she's in the media, and she's taking the sovereignty platform that we shouldn't allow excessive meddling by the U.S. and foreign countries in Ukrainian affairs. So this is interesting. Okay. Then you have Alexei Arestovich. He's doing the high-profile podcast circuit in America. He's probably too pro-Russian or too neutral or too objective to be accepted by the Americans. But personally, I think he's very credible. You have Alexander Dubinsky, who's in jail, who is a type of an anti-Zelensky Nelson Mandela type character, and who himself was a very credible and accomplished anti-corruption campaigner and politician in Ukraine. And then you have the British pick, which is Valery Zaluzhny, who's sitting in London and has a book out and has a beautiful suit and now speaks passable English. And he is ready to be parachuted into Kiev to control the military and somehow bring confidence to an unstable situation that a Zelensky departure would leave in Ukraine. So there's competing forces there, okay? And so that chaos could destabilize. Already you have Klitschko saying bad things about Zelensky in the media. So the solidarity looks like it's disappearing. And plus the U.S. is pumping money in there. It's become very corrupt, all the foreign aid and so forth. And Russia knows this, you see. Russia knows that there's dissident movements in Ukraine, anti-Zelensky, anti-conscription, pro-Russian. And there's even elements of the far right that are against Zelensky. And they're in effect allying with the pro-Russian dissidents, you see. They both want regime change. And over time, this is just going to increase. And in a place like Odessa, which is nominally Russian, these types of movements and issues are going to be long-term, no matter what happens now. So Russia could just as easily, go through the motions of these pseudo-negotiations, watch the situation deteriorate over time in Ukraine. The U.S. and Trump are confused. They don't know what they're going to do. I can't see a definitive direction until Trump leaves office. That's 3 years. And meanwhile, Russia is knocking on the door of the Dnieper River, and that's a game changer strategically. And so I think now Russia is really kind of in control of the political, the diplomatic, and the military arenas. But they're playing it very cool and not being bombastic about it and letting really the U.S. kind of, derail its own efforts in that way. And so this is a very interesting time right now. It's undeniable Russia is in the ascendancy militarily, but the British and the NATO believe that with enough time, new weapons, they can, bring new weapons into the mix in Ukraine, and there'll be game changers and more drone attacks. And they have all sorts of plans and ideas about destabilizing Russia and giving Ukraine that boost of confidence once again. But how realistic is this at this point? But politically, this is all they can do. They don't have a plan B that I can see right now in Europe and the US and Britain. I can't see the plan B. It's the plan A is all they have, which is keep this war going and at the expense of the Ukrainians, of course. So that's I can't see any policy change by the US, not vocally. Trump saying we need to end the killing is not really a policy change. They haven't come out and said definitively no NATO membership for Ukraine. Definitively 4 regions staying with Russia. At least in definitive terms, those are both realities. And if you can't articulate those in advance of signing a treaty, then it's not really serious negotiations. That's the way I'm looking at it.
Whenever Donald Trump talks about the battlefield and what's going on in Ukraine, he seems that he exaggerates the situation in favor of Ukrainians. He said that recently, he said that 112,000 soldiers on the part of the Russians, the casualty since January, and on the part of Ukraine, 8,000. The picture is so much exaggerated that anybody looking at his tweet and his posts and what's going on with the president of the United States. Is this the same guy that was talking about the conflict in Ukraine before being elected? So we have to understand what's going on in Washington in terms of what could happen in the meeting between the two presidents, because we've learned a lot about the new administration. They're in power more than 6 months. So how do you see the capabilities of this administration? Who has the upper hand in Ukraine? Is that the European? When I'm talking about European, I would assume that mostly I'm talking about the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. And who's running the show in Ukraine? Is that the British intelligence? Is somehow they collaborating with CIA? I don't know. The CIA under the Trump administration would be that much interested in Europe, totally in Europe. And I'm not talking about just Ukraine. But how do you see the relationship between the Europeans and the Trump administration, considering deep state in the United States, which are much more connected with Europeans than the Trump administration?
Yeah, so Donald Trump inherited an operation from the Biden administration that was very complex, and it's what the U.S. would call a classic division of labor operation. So on the military front, just on the political front, it's my understanding that the British provided close security protection for Zelensky. So he exists within that British bubble, and then he had direct contact with British intelligence, met them in London before things got critical in Ukraine. And so there's a direct line of contact there. But I think that's mostly for a special military operations. So Krinky, you heard about this disastrous raid at Krinky. And then, of course, Kursk. You see the British fingerprints on the planning. And, of course, everything in the Black Sea, all the sabotage, the Kerch Strait Bridge, attacks on Crimea, all the maritime raids and special ops. It is definitely British involvement, unmanned maritime drones and so forth, all that sort of stuff. So they're in a really important position, because if you think about derailing any political settlement, any negotiations, all it takes is one of these incidents. And what have we had before? Every single time there was some promising run-up to some kind of agreement, you had some military sabotage operation. And then, of course, the headlines are the daring, feisty Ukrainians. They're still willing to fight. Look at this, this daring, gallant raid by the brave Ukrainians. And look what they've done to Russia. They've really embarrassed Putin. And I think this really might be the beginning of the end for Russia. How many times have we seen that one play out in the media in the last 3 years? Probably, I don't know. I've lost count, maybe 20 times. So, but that's a really key point, is the British have the power to derail within that Ukrainian U.S. op. Now, the U.S. ultimately has of course, the most power, because they're providing the military capabilities. They're providing really the ISR, at the satellite level reconnaissance, the targeting information, everything to do with any of these advanced weapon systems. All of that's U.S. supplied. So, and then you have the SBU is more or less an adjunct of the CIA, and that's kind of admitted. And then politically, Zelensky's very much plugged into Brussels and Washington and London. So it is a division of labor. Europe is in a position where when they feel like Trump looks like he's drifting from taking a central responsibility role, the United States, and they're wanting to move in with more influence and more promises and pledges of support for Zelensky. But the Europeans are in total denial of the reality of the situation there. So everything you said before about exaggerating the casualties on the Russian side and underplaying the casualties on the Ukrainian side, that's pretty consistent through European leadership, British and American. So they're all pretty much on that same narrative page, because and that's also the Ukrainian political line too, because if you start reporting the truth about that situation, then you lose support in Ukraine, you will lose support in Europe, because Europeans will then regard that as an immoral proxy war, like Ukraine's paying too high a price from a human standpoint to carry on. From the US, shades of Vietnam, people get squeamish when the death toll gets too high, even in this situation. In a proxy war, they don't mind if the Russian casualties are high because they think they're winning. But the reality is it's the opposite. So the problem is this: you can lie and obfuscate this all you like. You can do this for years and years. But the problem is when it comes to negotiating or doing any serious diplomacy, you can't be in this state of suspended disbelief and fantasy reality to actually do real hard diplomacy and negotiations. Things have to be on the level and honest and real. Now, Russia also, of course, doesn't want to advertise its casualty numbers. I personally think they're much lower by orders of magnitude than the Ukrainians. But politically, it's not good for anybody to do that. But for Ukraine, it's especially bad because they're asking to make these huge sacrifices on behalf of who? On behalf of the national pride, on behalf of the Pravi sector or the hard right, or on behalf of Western governments that are feting Zelensky. Whereas in Russia, there's pretty broad support for President Putin, and they have very strong political support for this project. And of course, there's people in Russia that want to see it come to an end, and maybe some quicker than others, but the broad-based support and the commitments there. Not the case in Europe. It's not. It's the commitments there at the political level, but not at the public level. There's Ukraine fatigue is setting in Poland, in Romania, in Hungary, Central Europe, Slovakia, even Germany. Even the refugee situation is getting long in the tooth for Europe as well. And in the United States, Ukraine fatigue, even at the political level, is a reality, and it has been for a while. And that's how Donald Trump got elected on that issue. So there's a lot of things against this war, and there's very little holding it together. And what is holding it together is holding back any progress of a Western involved political settlement. I mean, I don't even understand what the Europeans and the U.S. can bring to any negotiations. It's almost better if they have to be out completely. They can't even be involved. It has to be, there's only one logical thing is terms of surrender. Now, there's one thing that could work, and the thing that could glue it together is if you had another world power, typically in these types of negotiations, to be a guarantor of whatever agreement. It would have to be somebody who's a non-NATO country and a country of good standing. For instance, Japan, China, Brazil. There's a number of candidates who could be the guarantor of an agreement. Turkey, I'm afraid, no, it's not going to work. And Turkey's a NATO member anyway, so they have a conflict of interest. South Africa or some major BRICS country, possibly, but probably not an African country. If that's the only thing that would work. But the problem is with the U.S. We've already gone down this route with the P5+1 and the JCPOA, and Donald Trump has a very poor record of abiding by his international commitments, as does the U.S. by extension. So that's another problem. Where's the solution for this? They've really blocked all possible political solutions. The United States themselves are a victim of their own mess and their own bad track record that started under Trump's first term. And I'm not letting Barack Obama off the hook either, because this whole maelstrom really begun with this latest phase begun with the Maidan in February 2014. But really, Trump's first term really accelerated this conflict and the arming of the Ukrainians and preparing them to NATO standard. And then when Biden came in, we all know what happened after that. So, I mean, I really don't see any possibility of this working, not under this U.S. administration. I really had high hopes for Trump coming in. I did, and many Americans did, but I really don't see it anymore.
It seems that the whole world seen Donald Trump as a extremely high-rank gold digger. It's unbelievable. You see, everywhere he goes, he wants something to get, he wants to get something from them. It goes to the Middle East, even with selling arms to Europeans. He's bragging about selling the weapons to Europeans, and they're gonna send it to Ukraine. By the way, I'm not gonna pay for that. How is that problematic in your opinion, in the eyes of the leaders like Putin, China, Iran? They're trying to negotiate, talk with Donald Trump, but they don't have that much to offer him in terms of the money, in terms of what he can get. It's somehow unbelievable because you see the United States as a country, how important is the role of the United States in all of these geopolitical issues. And you see Donald Trump is behaving somehow childish. How is that? What's the perception on the part of Europeans, in your opinion? Do they really feel that they can bribe Donald Trump into the continuation of the conflict?
Well, a perfect example, a couple of examples. One is, you remember the raw earth. What Donald Trump calls it raw earth. It's actually rare earth, but Trump has his own term, which is raw earths. And so he said, I've signed a raw earths deal with Zelensky. We've got this great deal. That's what the conversation was. You remember back in March, April, and still in May, that was still lingering. And of course, neither Zelensky nor Trump is in any position to do such a grand bargain. Okay. And this all sounded very good. And certainly BlackRock and, the big equity interests, global capital, let's call it, they like the sound of this until you start digging down into the details, and a lot of the profitable resources in what used to be Ukraine are in the eastern provinces. Okay. And also the developed resources. It would take time to prospect and develop for resources in Western Ukraine. And that's that's a big ROI, return on investment, that's required for any Western corporations. And Trump thought, we put U.S. firms in there with U.S. military protecting our firms. That guarantees the Russians won't attack us. So he's already basically turning U.S. corporations into human shields without even asking them. It sounded good for about a week. And then you can see what happened soon after Trump did this. You saw BlackRock pull out. They withdrew all these reconstruction plans, and that whole gambit basically has disappeared because it's not really a safe environment to be doing business, especially with this president. Okay. So he's done a deal. And so the value for Trump is in the headline initially that will get him from A to B. So get him from May to June. And he'll do the same thing with another situation. But first it was Greenland, then it was the Ukrainian raw earths. And then they're talking about, you remember before the Iranian sneak attack, when they were meeting in Oman, there were talks for a very brief period, I think it was through about a week, that, the potential for U.S.-Iranian cooperation on this, that, and the other. And it looked like, there's potential business to be done there and so forth. And of course, that dissipated into nothing. And you see this on every sort of juncture. And now you're even saying, well, you hear from certain members of the Trump administration, well, if Russia and the United States were to, come to some arrangement where they could work together on a number of things, including the Arctic, wow, that would be a win-win for everybody. But what's the likelihood of that happening? Slim and none. So Trump can't do deals, you see, because you can't write these things on the back of a napkin like you can when you're building a casino in New York or New Jersey. It just doesn't work. This is international relations is extremely complicated. It requires seasoned professionals, people who are career diplomats, negotiators, academics, people steeped in international law. And that's what's required just to get to the table to sign. So there's no deal that's going to be had in Alaska this week, for sure. At the best, it might reset negotiations to some friendly terms. At the worst, there could be some incident staged by the British or the Europeans or the Ukrainians that will blow everything up. Or even worse, they'll send Zelensky and he'll show up at the meeting and really upset President Putin and try to upstage him. I don't think that's going to happen, but it is on U.S. territory, so there is a possibility that could happen. But that would really be a bridge too far for the Russians. So there's nothing for Trump as president in the international arena. So he can't trade. You can do things domestically. You can run like you can be a mafia boss within the confines of the United States. And Trump is doing that right now. Okay. He is really strong-arming everybody from the judiciary to companies to opposition to all sorts. He's going after everybody. Media, he's intimidating and going after everyone. Can't do that internationally. You can to some weaker states, but Russia is not Iran. And with no disrespect to the Iranians, Russia is a much more powerful, much more stable, very strong institutions, strong military legacy as well, and very, very strong in diplomacy. The Russian Federation, they can outmaneuver and outclass pretty much anybody, probably, except that maybe the Chinese might be on the same level, and maybe past U.S. administrations were on that level, but not this administration, not the last one, the last two. The Obama administration did some very impressive things, like the Iran nuclear deal. That to midwife that over 2 years and get it signed and implemented is a huge achievement. Probably the only positive thing Obama did foreign policy wise that's on record. But nothing like that could ever be achieved with this current administration. And Russia now knows this, and the Chinese know this, and they're almost laughing under their breath, like, oh my gosh, when is this going to be over? Who's going to be the next guy in 3 years? We're waiting for the next one. And is he going to be less crazy or more crazy than this one? And they're just, Donald Trump has done more for BRICS, to promote BRICS. Donald Trump has done more to help BRICS in the last 2 weeks than any BRICS member has done. So I was joking the other day. I said that BRICS should give Donald Trump an award. They should present him with a medal, the BRICS Medal of Freedom or something like that, because he's done so much to help advance BRICS with the tariff wars and sanctions. So, I mean, honestly, this is just the way things are developing. It's so bizarre, but I think it's good for China. This has been very good for China, and pretty positive for Russia overall, and India as well. India has demonstrated its sovereignty on the international scene by pushing back on the United States with the tariff threats and not prohibition of buying Russian oil. I mean, India is not a second tier country. They're a powerhouse economically, and their supply chains are so tied to the U.S. and Europe that it doesn't make any sense to try to start an economic fight with a country like India. They're always going to be in the middle, and they're taking advantage. Modi is taking advantage of a situation created by the U.S. and the Europeans. They stupidly put a price cap on Russian oil, and India is just being capitalist, taking advantage. And they're getting upset about it. The U.S. is supposed to be the promoter of the free market. Well, you should be applauding Modi. He's taking advantage of the free market you created by putting a price cap on Russian oil. How can you complain? Honestly, I don't know.
I think what the United States has achieved so far in terms of the pressure coming to Brazil. Here in Brazil, I live in Brazil. I know how they feel about what's going on between Brazil and the United States. And on the other hand, on India was a big country. They were trying to play both sides, but I think they're getting to the point that they understand that the United States, even for the case of Ukraine, for the benefit of what's going on in Ukraine, they're going to hit India. They're going to attack them. And it's huge for them. And we can understand, because about that Vladimir Putin was talking with India, China, all these countries, Brazil, before going to the meeting, because after the talk he had with Steve Witkoff, he talked with BRICS countries mostly. And we know that a lot of pressure goes to Russia as well. Russia somehow, because of the tariffs, secondary tariffs, they're going to put pressure on India. India is so much important for Russia. We know how India was crucial for Russia in the conflict in Ukraine. India and China, And somehow Brazil, in the middle of nowhere, nobody was thinking about Brazil and coming against Brazil and interfering in domestic policy here in Brazil. It's unbelievable. When we look here, people, no one cares about what's going on. Here in Brazil, if you come to Brazil, you understand that nobody cares about what's going on out there in Ukraine, in the Middle East, that much. In the Middle East, much more sensitive here than Ukraine. But you see, these people are going against Donald Trump and his policies. What I'm trying to say is that how the pressure coming from the BRICS countries going to the Russian president has made him, it seems to me, is a political posture, is a political move on the part of Vladimir Putin. He wants to show that he's willing to do something. He's trying to negotiate with Donald Trump. He sees as a extremely positive sign after 3.5 years, he's going to talk with the president of the United States. Is important because the links are important, the talks are important after all. But in my opinion, even Vladimir Putin and his team, they know they're not going to get anything out of the meeting with Donald Trump. Do you feel that this is the perception on their part?
I think so. I've listened to the Russian foreign ministry for a long time. For many years, I've reported on them. I have met the deputy foreign minister, Ryabkov, and I've had brief conversation with him. And I've listened in Bennett speeches with Sergei Lavrov and seen what seen his views change and his attitude change over the years, to the point of Russia always had this open door policy. Like, things are bad, but we're always going to leave the door open, and we're always going to remain polite and have decorum, and even be polite and give extra leeway to the U.S. when they're saying and doing crazy things. But that changed. It changed to about two years ago, 3 years ago. Things begun to change to the point where, especially when there were attacks inside Russian territory, and that's when you saw a big difference in the attitudes and the change on the Russian side. So, they're very consistent. If you look at the Russian demands for Ukraine and for the West and NATO, they're fundamentally identical to the letter that was drafted in December 2021 that was sent to, I believe it was then Secretary Blinken, by the Russian Federation, which the U.S. sat on for 2 months, and then finally, sent a reply saying no, thank you in January, and then in early February, and we know what happened at the end of February, obviously, hasn't really changed that much. It's not fundamentally different from the Minsk process. The only difference is now Russia has new regions. But so the Russians have been consistent. So there's no way that they could believe that Trump is going to pull a rabbit out of his hat. I mean, so I think Russia's just adapted, and the Chinese and everyone is adapting to this new U.S. and not expecting them to do much, expecting them to say a lot, expecting them to do belligerent things, expecting them to launch tariff wars. But, when the U.S. is basically trying to blow up the WTO, and, the WTO, for all of its criticisms, provided, a level of stability in the international trade system that a lot of people got prosperous and profited from. It had a level of predictability, especially it gave an advantage to a lot of global South countries as well. The U.S., of course, have gamed all of those systems through multilateral institutions, and that's the source of U.S. power after the Second World War, is being able to dominate and game international multilateral institutions. And they benefited from that. They're a superpower because of those institutions. The value of the dollar, the stability of the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency, is because of the IMF. It's because of the WTO. It's because of all of these international institutions and the World Bank and so forth. It's not just from the private sector. It's also because of the international institutions and the UN and the Security Council. And the U.S. dominates all of these forums. And then this new president comes along with this anti-globalism kind of message, which is somewhat trendy, but doesn't really make any sense because it kind of denies the provenance of American hegemony and power, which is that America has power because it has allies that will cooperate with it. Even if they might not agree 100%, they'll cooperate. Now they're threatening all that. They're threatening the trust and cooperation side, and the WTO is based on trust and cooperation. So there's a vacuum, and what's filling the vacuum is a network of countries. BRICS is one example, where there's trust amongst BRICS members. That's all it is. It's a network based on trust. That's what BRICS is. So it's like, I'm going to invest with you. I'm going to sign that deal. We're going to, do this in 5 years, and it's not going to change. You can trust me. I'm going to sign. I'm Lula, but I'm going to sign this. But obviously, whoever comes after me, they're going to abide by that. That basic level of trust between nations, being agreement capable, which the U.S. is not anymore, then the U.S. can't do business. It can't do business internationally without that. You can't just do it by threats and intimidation, strong-arming people, which is all that's left of U.S. The Trump administration. It's baffling. I studied international relations. I studied sanctions. I did my master's dissertation on the weaponization of sanctions and financial warfare. And after studying sanctions, you realize that they actually don't work. When you're threatening the other party. The level of compliance is very low. The secondary sanctions are very effective among allies traditionally, but not against. So has Iran complied against, all these U.S. sanctions? North Korea, Russia, where's the compliance? I see no record of success. Did Syria comply? No, Syria collapsed eventually under the pressure of EU and U.S. sanctions and insurgency and subterfuge. But there's other countries that don't have those types of threats that Syria had to deal with. Just purely on an economic level, they were able to they've been able to batten down the hatches and do import replacement and adapt and trade with countries that like China and within the global South and the BRICS array and survive. And in some cases become better and more resilient through sanctions by unplugging from the globalization. Globalization is different from globalism, which is something people in the West get confused. Those two terms, they're very different. Globalization is international trade, labor advantage. Globalism is a type of an ideology concept that a lot of people, especially on the right wing, use to describe the UN and the WHO and technocracy and, Peter Thiel and Klaus Schwab and all this stuff. So those are two different things. So I think the U.S. is politically in a very confused state, and the rest of the world is just getting on with business. But the risk is, what damage can the U.S. and the Europeans do during this unstable transition period? That's the big risk.
How do you find the situation in the Middle East between Israel and Iran? We had a war between the two countries, 12 days of war. And right now, Israel again is talking about they're going to attack Iran. Doesn't matter if the United States would help them or not, but they're going to attack Iran. What was the outcome of the first attack? We assumed that they wanted to do regime change. They couldn't do it. And so if that was the case, what would bring to Israel? How Israel would benefit from a second war?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think Trita Parsi, who is in America, is Iranian originally, but he wrote an article recently, I think, for Foreign Policy on this very topic. And I think, of course, the 12-day war, as they call it, there is obviously the front end expectation is plan A was to destabilize the quote regime in Tehran. That was plan A. And somehow empower the MEK and these various agents of influence in subterfuge within Iran and so forth. And they were dangling Pahlavi his son around Washington on doing the media rounds. Kind of ridiculous. But anyway, that was plan A. And you know, they did do a lot to shock Iran in the first 48 hours. And they killed high-ranking military officials and nearly killed the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. So, but plan A's success chances in a country like Iran, I think, were very low. Knowing what I know or understand about Iran and the level of depth it has politically, culturally, strategically, that a hit and run decapitation strike, I don't think so. But that's something that the West have been pushing pretty hard politically in the US especially, this idea. And a lot of politicians are bought into this, and they support the MEK movement. They speak at their events. John Bolton, John McCain, they're all regular speakers at MEK rallies. Rudy Giuliani, you know, they've got so many people, Democrats and Republicans, they've got them on the payroll. And what they say to the Iranian diaspora, people who left when the Shah fell, and these are all very wealthy businessmen. These are very successful Iranians in Los Angeles and all around the country. The MEK will front these big conferences, and they'll have all these Iranian expatriates who would like to see the Islamic Republic fall. And they say to them, you know, we are going to support the MEK. This will be like John McCain back in the day. And we'll be marching on Tehran this time next year. Just give us your support. So they'll write out all their checks for the U.S. congressmen and senators because they believe that they're going to deliver regime change in Tehran, you see. And the MEK is just a vehicle, a financial vehicle for really circulating cash, which kind of originates with wealthy Iranians in the West, works through the MEK and through U.S. political parties, and it's just like it's a financial vehicle. They're promising a dream that probably they can never deliver, but it's the best show they have at the moment. Okay, so it still works, and they really got a great public relations win on the attack on Iran initially. That week in America, it was like, you know, they were really riding on a high. The Iranian expatriate community, the pro-Pahlavi royalists, the neocons, the Zionists lobby, and so they're all excited about this. And then Iran started hitting back. And no amount of propaganda could change that story after about a week, when you started seeing images of Tel Aviv getting completely wrecked. And it got so bad in Israel that the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, issued a couple of decrees. One was Israelis weren't allowed to leave. Had they been able to leave freely, probably you would have seen 500,000 people in Exodus over those 2 weeks. And so many institutions could potentially collapse as a result, including problems for the IDF. Okay, that was one of them. The other one was the Israelis clamped down on media coverage. No photographs of the damage of missiles, this kind of stuff. So this is real desperation. And Iran hitting all these military targets and institutions, I think it really hurt Israel to the point where Israel, I think, required the U.S. to bail them out. And that strike by the U.S. against Iran wasn't so much about, you know, stopping them from getting a bomb. I mean, it's just unlikely that, even though they had Iran enriching uranium, whatever advanced enrichment they were doing, I think was more to create bargaining leverage to bring the U.S. to a table to de-escalate rather than pursue an actual nuclear weapon. That's my belief. And I think they were successful, although the response by the U.S. wasn't in the form of diplomacy, it was in the form of bombs. But they did force the U.S. to react to the Iranian position. But I think for Israel is a disaster. Had that continued for another 2 weeks, you would have seen a collapse of the Netanyahu regime, a mass exodus from Israel, enough to really destabilize the country. And I think a permanent damaging of the Israeli brand as a regional hegemon. And I think it's already damaged. And I think Iran didn't want to go into full-scale blows with the United States for good reason, because the U.S. have a powerful and formidable military, and there's no other international actor that will restrain them. And so, but I think the calculus has changed, and so I think Israel is preparing to strike again, and that will definitely be in coordination with the United States again, because in their mind that was a successful tag team operation, and they will do it again. And so we'll see. But the Iranians also have adapted from an air defense position. From what we have read, that they have made changes, and of course they now know where the source of some of the attacks were in the initial surprise strike via Iraqi Kurdistan or Azerbaijan, for instance, and how the Israelis were using other territories adjacent to the Iranian territories to launch some of these attacks, plus cells within Iran, which I believe many of those may have been flushed out by now. So by the same token, Iran is in I think probably a good position to understand how that happened. So if you think about that, maybe that was really a one-shot deal for the Israelis and the U.S. And probably that was probably an operation that was probably planned for 2 years minimum, that initial strike on Iran. And will they be able to do that again? And to that effect, and what contingencies have the Iranians made? Probably significant changes. And so, and not only that, it galvanized the Iranian population in a way that nothing else could. And that's a huge difference, because if it's about breaking the regime and breaking the will of the people and the political confidence in the country, the West and Israel failed miserably there. And so now they have to contend with a more cohesive and more solidarity in Iran. That's the reality. And that is really hard, no matter what weapons you have. To overcome that from the outside, it's very difficult.
They're talking about, Patrick, they're talking about the disarmament of Hezbollah and Hamas in Lebanon and in Gaza. From what we've learned from Syria, they were all about it's about Bashar Assad, and Bashar Assad is the evil, it's the ultimate enemy of the West, and doing this, doing that. And they put a Al-Qaeda, how can HTS group in Al-Jolani, he was chopping up the head of people before going to Syria, and right now he's the president, as they're talking about, and that's the United States supporting him. What do they want from Lebanon, in your opinion? And disarmament, it seems to me, is so much delusional if you think that, because Hezbollah, even after the decapitation, the assassination of the leaders of Hezbollah, the Israelis went underground to the southern part of Lebanon. They tried to do something, they couldn't achieve what they wanted to achieve. That's why they went after a ceasefire before the regime in Syria falling apart. So how can you imagine that they're going to be, even though having the government in Lebanon somehow cooperating with them? We know the army in Lebanon is hugely influenced by Shia faith in Lebanon. Is that all delusional? I would argue, even with the case of Hamas, that would be the same, because if Hamas without arms, what does that mean for Palestine, for Gaza?
Yeah, without arms, then Gaza becomes the West Bank. They want to PAify Gaza, and so for Lebanon, that's the gambit. This is the first round. The first round is demand Hezbollah disarm. So this is from an Israeli point of view, this is dismantling the resistance, and so they feel the hub of the resistance. Now we know. All the people saying, "Oh, Assad, the butcher, Assad regime, Assad must go," all these years, lying about all these atrocities that Assad allegedly did, but nobody can prove. The Amnesty International doing fake reports about Sidnaya prison and fake chemical weapons attack claims by Bellingcat and everybody else. They can't make anything stick. But Jolani, a Western and Turkish and NATO-backed, Israeli-backed former, deputy of al-Baghdadi, founder of al-Qaeda in Syria, he's actually doing the atrocities. He's actually doing the pogroms. He's doing the slaughters and street executions, the mass rape, the kidnapping of women to the bridal markets of Idlib, all the horrific persecution of ethnic minorities and religious minorities. This regime's doing it, and he's doing it with the backing of the West. Nobody's moved in to stop them or even condemn him. They're instead inviting him for tea in their palaces in Europe. Okay, so now we have a situation where the Lebanese can see Syria had a strong central government. This is the important concept people need to understand. The Syrian government under Assad, the Ba'athist system, very strong, very tight, very cohesion. It's a national security kind of hard shell. And because they're at war with their neighbor for so long, 50 years and whatnot, and the risk of infiltration and regime change. The U.S. tried to assassinate and overthrow Syria like at least 12 times since the 60s. So obviously they're a product of their environment and geopolitically. But Syria was the hub of the resistance. They were the glue that held everything together, with Iran, with Hezbollah, with the resistance in Palestine and the occupied territories, and the Hashid, the PMUs in Iraq, and so forth. And when Assad fell, you could see in 72 hours, Israel took out all of the air defenses in Syria, all of the military bases, the entire Syrian Navy. And that was the only thing keeping the Israelis from taking the entire Golan Heights and Mount Hermon to have full strategic command and control over the most important geopolitical piece of real estate in the entire Middle East. It's Mount Hermon and the Golan Heights. And Jolani, a bunch of thugs who took Damascus, just stood back and allowed Israel to walk in. Not a shot was fired. And not only that, you saw the slaughter and the attack on the Druze in Sweda in the south. So the Lebanese are looking at this like, if we disarm, if Hezbollah disarms, it's going to be a bloodbath in the south. Israel will move in so fast and hard. But then, so what the U.S. is doing, and the Gulf too, but Tom Barak is Trump's envoy for the Middle East. He's saying you have two choices. The Lebanese army, the government needs to disarm Hezbollah, or, the quiet part is there's going to be a civil war in Lebanon. So giving them a choice of two bad outcomes, and thinking that this is going to work in Lebanon. I don't think this is going to work. I don't think Hezbollah will disarm because of what they have witnessed, because they know that Jolani will roll into Tripoli, and they know there's going to be a bloody sectarian civil war in Lebanon. Israel will move hard in the south. Jolani will move hard in the north to the Sunni enclaves, and then Israel will bomb Shiite neighborhoods in Beirut, which they've already shown they can do with impunity. They'll crush villages in the south. They'll turn it into Gaza. They will, and no one will stop them, not the Americans or anybody. And the Christian pro-U.S. factions in Lebanon will cheer this on, and there will be guaranteed protection by the U.S. with their fortress embassy on the hill above Beirut, and they'll be applauding Israel for disarming and getting rid of the Hezbollah problem and vanquishing Iranian influence from Lebanon, as if, and because the talking point is with these people is, oh, Iranian influence, Iranians interfering in Lebanese politics. What's the United States doing? The United States prohibits the Lebanese army from having any airplanes, air defense, tanks, Cornet missiles, no air, no ground, nothing. They want the Lebanese army to be basically a domestic security force. In fact, Tom Barak has said so much. So so they want them to be totally subservient with no ability to defend themselves, no ability to defend their borders. And so I think the cynical U.S. plan A is to try to get them to disarm, and the Gulf will pump in money and buy off as many Lebanese politicians as possible, try to buy off Shia as well. But they think that if this doesn't work, plan B would be, I think, to then fracture the Lebanese army, because the Lebanese army is the only institution that's holding the country consistently together. Okay, and it's multi-denominational, but as you pointed out initially here, Nima, is that the 30% or 35% are Shiite in the Lebanese army. So if they make the Lebanese army try to disarm Hezbollah, it's going to fracture the Lebanese army, and then the U.S. will say, "Oh, they're illegitimate now. They're not, doing their job, and they're not fit for purpose. So we need international forces in there to maintain order." And they'll work with the local warlords like they did after the last civil war. The warlords are still in place, north, south, in the center. Okay, and they think that they can manage this with Israeli enforcement as well, and they think they can do this. But I don't think the U.S. has any respect for Lebanese sovereignty, and if it's a case of giving a piece to Jelani and a piece to Israel, and the other some international administration, and maybe Trump will say, "We're going to take this and we'll have it under U.S. control, under my authority," like Gaza, then that's probably a possibility. But the reality of this happening is different, because Syria fell because there was a strong central government, and the public is used to being compliant to a strong central government. And when that central government collapsed, the public wasn't able to mobilize. And so this terrorist faction moved in with very few men, by the way, really a force of something like 40,000, and very disparate, not an organized military, but they still took power. But Lebanon is a weak central government, and strong peripheries, and strong tribes, factions, and so forth. And people are very self-sufficient in Lebanon. They have had to be self-sufficient for a long, long time, and very adaptable. So the government, I don't think, is going to, they can't dictate anything like what the U.S. is hoping they're going to do. And I honestly don't think the Lebanese want to fight another bloody civil war, no matter what. And I think somehow this is not Syria. And the chances of success are very, very dicey for Israel and the U.S. And by the way, they say Hezbollah is finished. Hezbollah is weak. Nasrallah was assassinated. Hezbollah is in disarray. The Hezbollah today in 2025 is by orders of magnitude stronger today than it was in 2006. So even if it was at 2006 levels, it's still going to mount a resistance. But the Hezbollah today is stronger, even without a supply line coming from Syria. So I guess it could take time for Israel and the U.S. to do this, maybe years, if they're planning for years. But the political timelines are very short for Israel and for the U.S. on this. The Lebanese, this is their life. They're used to this. They have much more time in Lebanon, but the political timelines in Israel and the U.S. are very short. And I will say for Ukraine, the U.S. and Europe's very short timelines they're working on. Zelensky, extremely short. Russia, extremely long. Russia's like, well, we can resolve this in 20 years. We just need to get there now, and we'll wait 10 years, and we'll see. Odessa will come around after 10 or 15 years, and that's fine by us, as long as they have their national security priorities taken care of. The main ones, the NATO threat with Ukraine, and maybe a missile agreement with the West at some point. And hopefully there's not World War III is going to break out. But Russia's very pragmatic. Likewise, the Lebanese, as chaotic as it is, they're also, used to fighting. They're used to this type of thing, and they will adapt. And I don't think the U.S. has the level of patience to, I think there is a rush by especially Netanyahu and the hard right in Israel they're working on borrowed time, and they need to. Netanyahu just came out today and admitted there's a greater Israel project. That was meant to be a conspiracy theory. It's out in the open now. So they're really pushing it hard, and that's when obviously mistakes can be made. And these people have always resisted. How long has there been a resistance in Lebanon? Long time. They're going to be there. And in Palestine too, I will say, as bad as things are in Gaza, and they're bad, there's always going to be a resistance in Gaza, I think. But yeah, so it's not a great situation. It's potentially really bad, a potential bloodbath. I think the U.S. and Israel have no qualms wrecking Lebanon and carving it up, to be honest. And that would be a huge shame. But, you know, do they care in Washington about Lebanese traditions, history? I don't think so. Not that much.
Their memory is so short, they don't they don't care about. They see these people as all the same. They don't recognize the difference between the cultures, the difference between the attitude, and they feel that Hezbollah and Hamas are the same. They're not the same. Houthis, they, by the way, they made the same mistake during the Trump administration. They wanted to fight Houthis, and said, Pete Hegseth came out and said, this time would be different. We're gonna hit them hard. They're gonna learn the lesson. And Donald Trump announced that the Houthis are capitulating. We're living. Yeah.
Unbelievable. You know how weak the Houthis were, Ansar Allah, when they declared war on them during Obama's second term in March 2015. That's when the proxy war against the U.S. proxy war against Yemen began. Saudi Arabia and the UAE versus Yemen. And look how after 9 years of bombardment, look how strong Ansar Allah has become after being hammered by world superpowers for like 7 straight years, probably. And what do you think they're going to be like in the next 7 years? Do you think they're going to be weaker, or are they going to be stronger? I think they're going to be a lot stronger and more adaptable and smarter. And I think countries like Yemen have the potential to stabilize the region, actually, because of that, and because they recognize principles like sovereignty, they recognize the Genocide Convention, they recognize the human rights conventions, and that's what they're acting upon when they are interdicting Israeli shipping or firing missiles into Eilat port or hitting Ben Gurion airport. They made their demands very public. We're doing it because of this. So they're being honest and straight. Like when the U.S. said we're goes to the UN, we're mounting a humanitarian intervention to save the people of Libya or Iraq or whatever. That's what they're doing publicly. Yemen's doing the same thing, arguably on much stronger moral grounds and legal grounds, okay, for international institutions. So to think that Yemen is going to wither away and, become weaker after being hit hard by the U.S. for what, 7 weeks? 7 weeks. And the U.S. couldn't continue. They started losing aircraft. The USS, I think it was Ford or one of their aircraft carriers was damaged. They said it was because of a storm. I can't remember the excuse they had, but who knows what the source of that damage was. The U.S. lost more drones and aircraft in 7 weeks against Yemen than I think they did in probably any other single conflict that they engaged in. I mean, that is something. That's historic. Pete Hegseth should get fired or resign after that. I mean, because that would have been on the head of the defense secretary normally, or a general would. I mean, it's just a poor performance by the United States. So, I mean, politically, shouldn't even have gone there, but militarily they went, and I think it was kind of a failure by the U.S. So, I mean, what are these people thinking? Likewise, there's a number of other actors in the region. Certainly, Iran. Is Iran going to be stronger and more adept and more capable in 10 years than they are now? I think so. And it probably orders of magnitude more than Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and probably even stronger than Israel on a conventional level. Maybe not with the Air Force and the F-35 fleet and so forth. But in terms of missile tech, surveillance, satellite reconnaissance, AI, hacking, uh, I wouldn't expect Iran is going to not be formidable in the future. So you have to start to negotiate and talk to these people and come to some kind of regional security arrangement, because the alternative is full-blown war. And the collateral damage isn't necessarily going to be Iran as much as it will be some of the surrounding countries, possibly. And who wants that? Certainly, global capital doesn't want that. They want stability. They want to invest. They've got ideas for, projects and advancements in the region, and so do the Gulf states. So it shouldn't be in their interest to go down this belligerent route. And that's the problem with Israel, because that seems to be the only route Israel has at the moment. And that becomes a liability for the money. So that's one potential hope, that situation economically is just not going to make sense. This supporting the state of Israel in its, as a European colonial project that needs to be at war with all of its neighbors and needs to take territory from all of its neighbors to secure itself, needs a U.S. military footprint that big just to protect it from missiles and drones and counterstrikes and so forth. I mean, that's a big commitment for this little piece of real estate that's really acting as a U.S. beachhead or Anglo-American imperial beachhead. But maybe the Americans don't need that beachhead. Maybe they can achieve those geopolitical aims by having a stable Middle East and doing other types of business or relationships with the people in the region. I don't know. I think Israel made sense to the British and the Americans back in the 20th century, and maybe even into the late 20th century. I don't think it makes much sense now.
I think, just to wrap up this session, Patrick, what they did to Iran and the transformation that is happening in Iran in the aftermath of in Iran, they somehow expected that Israel would attack them, but they never thought that the United States would join Israel. Even a symbolic attack, that is huge in the mind of Iranians. The society has been transformed totally. Patrick, you talk with politicians, those people who are arguing we can be closer to the West, those are getting weaker as time goes by, and Iran's strategy is hugely changing. And I think we will learn about it in the next 10 years to come. Iran going to be totally different country, totally different strategy toward the West. And I don't know, the people in Washington and Trump administration understand the gravity of what's going on and their action, the outcome of their action in the Middle East. That would be huge, in my opinion.
No, definitely. That's a big factor. Yeah. That's changed.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Patrick, for being with us today. Great pleasure to have you on.
No, it's
I
great.
think our audience enjoyed a lot your comments on the issues in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and the situation with the Trump administration and the foreign policy of the United States. Thank you so much.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you very much, Neil.
See you soon.